My books, The Origin of Names, Words, and Everything in Between, volumes 1 and 2, are available to purchase from most major booksellers in all major formats. Order your copies today so you can enjoy these books for yourself and help support the channel. Fonts on a surface level might seem like relatively simple things, a means to an end to represent letters in the written form. Most of the time, I imagine that you don't even think twice about the font you're going to use. And yes, I know technically they aren't called fonts, they're called typefaces, but we're going to call them fonts for ease's sake. Fonts, however, haven't always flown so far under the radar. During the course of human history, fonts have inspired conversation, changed the way we view certain things, and even led to debate. Though perhaps the most notorious historical event revolving around fonts was the centuries-long dispute between two of them in one nation in particular. Yeah, an argument between two fonts took literally hundreds of years to be resolved. Like I said, fonts are more than just little letters on a screen or a piece of paper. Of course, the land where this dispute took place was Germany, and the fonts in play were the ones by the names of Antiqua and Fraktur. This whole episode is known as the Antiqua-Fraktur dispute. Like, it has its own Wikipedia page and everything. Something you may be wondering is, how did two simple fonts cause such an uproar across an entire nation? Well, these fonts came into the spotlight at the time when Germany was struggling with its national identity, and these fonts came to reflect the views of Germans as a whole. What font you chose could imply your thoughts on the nation and the language. One of these fonts was seen as being the true font that all Germans should be using, and was installed with nationalistic pride, while the other was seen as the outsider font, an inferior font used by the rest of the world. Why don't we actually take a look at these fonts? Here we have the font of Antiqua. As you can see, it is very much the textbook old world timey kind of font, slightly cursive with letters attached to one another. This font was created to look as close to actual handwriting as possible. Good handwriting anyway, not mine, that's for sure. It was created to specifically look similar to the handwriting of the Romans, who by the late 15th century when this font came into being, has started to be revered for their ingenuity after their influence had fallen out of fashion for much of the Middle Ages. This font would go on to be heavily linked with Rome and the Latin/Romance speaking world. The name of this font of course comes from the word of antique/antiquity, as it was created to look like the writing of the ancient world. Fraktur on the other hand looks like this. This is a big, bold font, with jagged ends and letters that are separated from one another. The letters not joining up is why it has that name of Fraktur, coming from fractured, as the letters of the words in these fonts are quite literally fractured. You have probably seen Fraktur or a similar font to it all over the place. It is a distinctly medieval/Germanic looking font. It wouldn't look out of place in any kind of fantasy setting or a villain's lair. Fraktur came into being in around 1515. Emperor Maximilian I of the Holy Roman Empire commissioned a new font to be used in the books of his library. That font ended up being Fraktur. It was based on an older font named Schwarbacher, which unto itself is part of a series of fonts known as Black Letter, which encompasses many of those fonts you see in medieval writing, which are pretty much impossible to read for our modern eyes. It's also worth noting that neither of these fonts of Antiqua or Fraktur are actually singular fonts, but rather families of fonts that have a similar style. As you can see, these two fonts are fairly different from one another, but it's not only in their design where they differ. Each font picked up different connotations for itself. Antiqua was this font linked with all things Latin and learned, whereas Fraktur was a font linked with power, strength, and of course, the German language. These two fonts came into being around the same time as two other big historical events that took place in Germany. The Protestant Reformations fronted by one Martin Luther, and of course the creation of the printing press by one Johannes Gutenberg. These two fonts were able to spread thanks to the invention of the printing press and played a large role in the Reformation too. These fonts ended up having religious connotations linked with them as well. Antiqua was seen as the font of Catholicism. This makes sense because, as mentioned, it was linked with Rome, Latin, and the Romance languages as a whole. And as Romance-speaking parts of the world tended to fall on the Catholic side of things post-Reformation, it makes sense as to why they would use it too. Fraktur, on the other hand, was seen as the font of Protestantism. This form of Christianity was a distinctly German creation, and where it flourished the most was in other Germanic-speaking parts of the world, like Britain and Northern Europe. Likewise, Fraktur was a proud German creation too, so it only makes sense why these two Germanic inventions of Protestantism and Fraktur would get intermixed and connected with one another. So just to recap, we have one font, Antiqua, linked with Catholicism and all things Latin/Romance language, and we have another font, Fraktur, linked with all things Protestantism and German/Germanic language. By the early 16th century, these two fonts were a thing. The Reformation had kicked kicked off and the printing press was well and truly established. So with all these factors at play, Europe took to typing and writing in their font of choice. And on the whole over the centuries, that font of choice was actually Antiqua. It was far easier to read compared to Fraktur. Antiqua is still fairly easy to read for us today, compared to Fraktur anyway. It also became the go-to font for people in the world of science and all things educated. This was due to its links with ancient Rome. Though of course, one country that didn't adopt Antiqua was Germany. And when I say Germany, I mean the landmass that we now consider Germany, which contains many German/Germanic speakers. Germany is a European country that has shifted its borders an awful lot over the years, due to a whole variety of factors such as being parts of other empires and due to being split into two for large portions of time. Whatever the case, Antiqua was seen as a resoundingly un-German font, and one that their beloved language, which was so different to the other languages spoken in Western Europe which were primarily Romance in origin, shouldn't be written in. This deep love for the Fraktur font and resentment towards the Antiqua font in Germany really came into play in 1806. It was in this year that the Holy Roman Empire, which encompassed much of modern Germany, dissolved, and large parts of Germany were instead occupied by Napoleon. This rocked the German national identity, which is understandable. There's many instances of nations throughout history trying to reclaim their identity after occupation from another power. The events of 1806 saw a huge surge in German nationalism, meaning people wanted to show more pride in their nation. One of the ways in which this nationalism manifested itself was through the recording of as much German literature as possible. People wanted as much German writing preserved as possible in the event that the language was banned or ceased to exist for some other reason. And of course, it was decided that all this German writing should be written in the most German font possible, Fraktur. This rise in nationalism was all about preserving the German identity, and this font had become a huge part of that identity. Since its inception in 1515 up to this point, most other places stopped using it, minus Germany, something that many Germans took pride in, something that made them stand out amongst the nations of Europe. So Fraktur was used to celebrate the German identity, and Antiqua was seen as the font used by all other languages and writing. This might seem a tad odd, but people take pride in strange things when the idea of their nation is removed from them. For example, the first thing I did when I got back from my recent trip to St. Louis was eat a sausage roll from Greg's. If you know, you know. Germany was unified into a single state in 1871, and it was at this time they declared Fraktur as their official font, to be used in all official writings and documents. This makes sense. Germany had up until this point been fighting for its identity, so it's only fitting that when they had their own unified German country, they used the most German font possible. Though of course, not everyone was happy about this universal use of Fraktur. This is the Antiqua-Fraktur dispute after all. Everyone took sides on this dispute, and it became an ideological issue between the people of Germany. Those against Antiqua saw it as being un-German, and the people used it as traitors to the land, while those against Fraktur saw it as being old-fashioned, stuck in the past, and full of rampant nationalism. Seriously, these fonts caused quite an uproar in the land. Notable Germans who preferred Antiqua included philosophers Goethe and Nietzsche, as well as Jacob Grimm, one half of the Brothers Grimm, who recorded many Germanic fairy tales which are still popular to this day. The big advocate of the Fraktur font, however, was Otto von Bismarck, former Chancellor of the land and perhaps the most German person ever. He refused gifts of German books which were written in the Antiqua font and said on the matter, "I don't read German books in Latin letters." And of course there was also the religious issue too, with the font being split between Catholicism and Protestantism. Apparently this divide in font preference was so fierce in Christianity that a Protestant Bible was created, which used Fraktur for all the positive passages about God and Jesus, but switched to Antiqua for anything relating to hell or damnation or suffering. These two fonts created a huge divide in the people of Germany. It was as if everyone had to take a side, and the dispute carried on into the 20th century. It was in this century, however, that things were finally resolved, and that resolution came from a group of people who were in power in Germany, whose names I can't really say due to the fact it might demonetize this video. I'm sure you know who they are, but to err on the side of caution, I will be referring to them as the Ns and their leader as simply H. The Ns were all about German nationalism, as I'm sure you know, so unsurprisingly they used the Fraktur font extensively. Much of their messaging and their propaganda featured this font to cement it as the German font. The leader's book even used the font on its front cover. Yet, oddly enough, that leader H wasn't actually a big fan of it. He actually preferred Antiqua, and this is so odd because his party was using it extensively. Though in all honesty, it's not worth thinking too much about the logic of this awful human being. In one speech to the Reichstag in 1934, he said, "Your alleged Gothic internalization does not fit well in this age of steel and iron, glass and concrete, of womanly beauty and manly strength, of heads raised high and intention defiant. In 100 years, our language will be the European language. The nations of the East, the North and the West will communicate with us, learn our language. The prerequisite for this, the script called Gothic is replaced by the script we have called Latin so far," which reflects his thought on the script, which is referred to as Gothic as Fraktur has a long history of the Gothic style. H finally got his wish, however, in 1941. It was in this year that Fraktur was banned in Germany. Yet this dispute got to a point where it was so contentious that a font had to actually be banned by a government. H and the Ns declared Fraktur as not truly German and even claimed it had Jewish qualities to it, which of course wasn't positive for these guys. Like I mentioned, it's so weird they were using this font and all of a sudden stopped using it. But these guys were monsters who threw logic out the window. This meant that Antiqua became the standard font of Germany, and in the aftermath of the Second World War, Fraktur was used less and less due to its deep ties with the Ns, even though they were the ones who banned it. Between then and now, both the fonts of Antiqua and Fraktur are seen as being pretty outdated and old-fashioned. No one uses either of them all that much anymore, unless it's for something that is intentionally old-fashioned looking like a D&D map or something. Today, however, modern Germany has a whole slew of different official fonts. Berlin has its own font called Berlin Type, which has been used since 2021 and is free to download for yourself. Funnily enough, the All About Berlin website, which talks about Germany's fonts, highlights Fraktur, saying anyone should be cautious with using it as it is seen as old-fashioned and linked with the Ns, which perfectly sums up the legacy of a font, which was once so deeply linked with this nation. What this all shows us, however, is that a font can be way more than just a simple way to show text. They can almost break a nation. Well, maybe break is too strong a word and a tad hyperbolic, but it sounds good for a YouTube video title. Name Explain depends on viewers like yourself supporting the channel financially on Patreon, so a huge thank you to everyone who does. Donating just $1 a month helps the channel amazingly and gets you bonuses including ad-free videos, exclusive content, the power to request ideas to be made into actual Name Explain videos, and your name at the end of the video with all these awesome people. Visit patreon.com/NameExplain or click the link down below to find out how you too can support the channel. Thank you. Thanks for reaching the end of the video. Why not watch another and subscribe to keep up to date on all things Name Explain. You can find myself on Instagram where I'm NameExplainYT and join the Facebook group Friends of Name Explain to talk with myself and other name nerds. All that will be linked down below. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and once again, thank you all so much.